Where are we in the airline recovery right now, and what does the future look like? What if I told you that one airline, for example, carried 2 million passengers more in July this year, 2022, than they did before the pandemic in 2019? For how that was possible and what the rest of the industry looks like, stay tuned. If you're a regular viewer of this channel, you know that the COVID-19 pandemic had some extraordinary consequences, both for airlines, but crucially also for pilots, cabin crew, maintenance personnel, everyone working at the airport, and practically everyone else. Now, more than 2 years after the pandemic broke out, there are some solid signs of a rebound, but it's shown in a very chaotic way. We now also have to take into effect the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has had a profound effect on the long-haul part of the aviation business, but also the increase in fuel prices that it has brought with it for us, normal consumers, as well as the short-haul part of the industry. On top of that, the international travel restrictions are not completely gone everywhere either. So right now is probably a good and quite interesting time to sit back and have a look at where we are in the recovery, especially if you are a budding pilot out there and you want to know what your chances are. 2 years ago, in the middle of the first lockdown of the pandemic, I did a video over on the Mentour Pilot channel where I outlined 3 possible scenarios for the airline recovery. The first scenario said that 2020 was going to be a completely lost year, but that we would see some recovery during 2021. The second was that 2020 and 2021 was going to be lost and that we would start to see a recovery in 2022. And the third scenario was the doomsday scenario, where the airline business would be completely frozen up until at least 2022, and that the recovery wouldn't come until maybe 2023 or even later than that. My prediction was a combination of scenario 1 or 2, where we would see a slight improvement during the autumn of 2021 and then a bigger improvement during the whole of 2022. And now the judgment seems to be coming in, and it looks like that's pretty accurate. However, the recovery is not uniform throughout the industry. In the United States, for example, we've seen a very robust comeback during the last year or so, and that's largely down to the size of the population and the strength of its domestic airline business, where, because it has basically taken place inside of the United States, have not suffered so much from international travel restrictions. In Europe and inside of the European Union, it was supposed to work in the same way, with a lot of small countries working together and having the same set of rules and regulations, but unfortunately that did not work during the pandemic, and that's why we've seen a significantly slower comeback in the European aviation markets. Within the Asian aviation market, there is still quite a few travel restrictions that are still ongoing, which is hampering the recovery over there. Now, even within these markets, there are big differences between companies that are flying short to medium haul and companies that are largely dependent on their long haul operation. The long haul operators have suffered by far the most during the pandemic, and right now most of them are back to the same number of flights as they were prior to the pandemic, but their load factor, as in how many people are actually flying inside of their aircraft, is still quite a way off, and it's likely that it's going to take at least until 2023 and possibly beyond before they're back to the same level of load factor. Now, it's worth noting here that there are some seasonal differences as well, and during the last few months, which is the summer here in the Northern Hemisphere, even the long-haul airlines have managed to fill up their cabins quite well. The problem for them, though, is that traditionally they have been relying a lot on the income that they were generating from business travelers. And those business travelers are still not back. And there's a question of whether or not they will ever come back. Now, the companies that were focusing on short to medium haul, as in flights up to maybe 5-6 hours or so maximum, they are in some cases back to or even above the levels they were in 2019. And that's significant because 2019 was actually a record year for the industry. Now, it's worth mentioning here that I am far from the only one that was making predictions back in the spring of 2020. A lot of industry organizations like IATA, for example, was making their own predictions, and the problem was that a lot of airlines, and specifically airport, was basing their decision on whether or not to keep employees on their payroll or not on those predictions, and we're going to get back to that soon. Another thing that I talked about in that video back in 2020 was that I thought that the survival and the eventual recovery of the airlines was going to be dependent a lot on how much money they have, how good their financial situation was. Now, we know that what actually happened during the pandemic was that some countries and their governments decided to come in and prop up and financially help some of their airlines to keep them from going under. But what's really interesting here is not which of these airlines survived the pandemic, but who actually took the opportunity and had the financial strength to make an opportunity of this crisis, that actually came out stronger from the pandemic than they were before. And I'm going to tell you all about that after this short message from my sponsor. Do you want to feel smarter by watching great documentaries? Well, in that case, you have to check out today's sponsor, which is CuriosityStream, an affordable streaming service with top quality content. Dive deeper into science, space, technology, nature, history and health and much more with award-winning non-fictional series. CuriosityStream adds new shows every single week, and a documentary that I've just been watching is called The World's Most Useful Airport, about how the airport at St. Helena is trying to make the island more accessible again after more than 500 years of isolation. And if you like the content that I'm producing on this channel, then I know you're gonna like that one as well. CuriosityStream is crazy good value for money at under $20 per year, but since you guys are followers of this channel, we are offering a further 25% reduction of that, which brings it down to $1.25 per month, which is insane. If you want to jump in and get access to the service right now, well then click on the link in the description below, which should be something like curiositystream.com/mentornow and a few figures on it. Also use the discount code MENTORNOW. That gives you access to the full discount and it really supports my sponsors, which supports me. You won't regret it. Now back to the video. So which airlines have actually managed to get through this crisis in the strongest possible way and maybe even made it into an opportunity? Well, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, one airline flew 14.8 million passengers in July of 2019 and flew 16.8 million passengers in the same month this year. And that company is Ryanair in Europe. Explaining how they did this is actually quite simple. It comes down to two different reasons. The first reason is simply that they have a bigger fleet of aircraft now than they did back in 2019. In the beginning of the summer season this year, they had about 505 aircraft to compare with the 450 that they had back in 2019. And that's even though they have returned quite a few of their older aircraft back to lessors during the pandemic. So right now, Ryanair itself owns outright all of the aircraft they're flying. The only aircraft that the Ryanair group are actually leasing at the moment are a couple of Airbus A320s that's flying for Lauda Air. What this means operationally for Ryanair is that not only do they have a bigger fleet in total, which logically can carry more passengers, the aircraft in that fleet are also newer and some of them are of a more efficient model, meaning that there's less maintenance and that they can carry those passengers at a lower cost. On top of that, the fact that they're not leasing any of their aircraft means a total lower cost base overall. But that's not all here. The second explanation is that Ryanair had the foresight and the economy to keep its employees employed and current during the pandemic. Now, they did renegotiate the salary packages and deals with its employees in order to try to preserve cash flow as much as possible, but they did make sure that they had the personnel available to them to be ready when they saw that there was a turn in the market for the better. This included extreme measures like, for example, packing 737s full of pilots and flying between the different bases in the network to their simulator centers to have the pilots do 3 takeoff and landings to keep them current and also to do their 6-month recurrent checks. And also they would have aircraft doing technical flights to keep the fleet completely current. But this meant that once there was an uptick in passenger demand again, Ryanair could immediately pounce on that and start taking back and even expanding market share. And that strategy also meant that Ryanair suffered far less delays and cancelled flights during this chaotic summer. But Ryanair is far from alone here. Wizz Air has also increased their fleet size, and even though we don't have the July figures for 2022 for Wizz Air yet, we do know that in 2019, the 3 months leading up to the 30th of June, they flew 10.4 million passengers, and in the same period this year, they flew 12.2, so they're also doing all right. Wizz Air even did a deal with Airbus during 2020 and 2021 to accept quicker deliveries of their new Airbus 320 Neos when other airlines were cancelling their orders or delaying them. So that also shows some quite good foresight. Now, for those of you who haven't heard about Wizz Air is actually owned by the same company group that also owns Frontier Airlines in the United States. And when talking about the United States, Southwest Airlines also showed that they had enough cash to avoid reducing their operation during the pandemic. They did thin out some flights on some destinations where they saw that there wasn't enough demand, but they also increased their frequency on some of the routes, and they even started flying to some new airports. On top of that, some smaller airlines in the US, like Allegiant for example, also showed that they had enough cash to expand their fleets. Now, you might have noticed a theme here, and that is that all of these airlines that I've just been talking about are low-fare airlines, but that's not necessarily the point. The point here is more likely that these airlines had enough cash with them going into this crisis so that they could maintain both their personnel and their aircraft fleet and even grow it during the crisis. They also didn't have to rely on long-haul or business travelers in order to keep the cash flow going and maintaining a healthy profit margin. But some of the other bigger airlines out there were just unable to keep their fleet size during the pandemic. American Airlines, for example, had to retire their 757s and their 767s in order to try to stem their flow of cash going out. And Delta retired their MD-80s, their MD-90s, and crucially their wide-body Boeing 777s as well. One exception to this in the US was United, who retired some individual aircraft but didn't retire an entire aircraft fleet. In Europe, that's exactly what British Airways and KLM did when they retired all of their Boeing 747s. Those decisions to retire those older aircraft made absolute sense back in 2020 when it was all about conserving cash flow. But these airlines who did that are now paying a price for it because, as some analysts were putting it, you can't expect to get back to 2019 levels of passengers if you don't have the 2019 number of seats available. Nonetheless, the airlines are now starting to order new aircraft again. And back in 2021, it was mostly about short to medium-haul single-aisle aircraft. But we're now expecting in 2022 that we're going to start to see some larger orders for some wide-body aircraft as well. And here is where the problems Boeing has been having to deliver their 787s is going to start becoming really important. And I did a video about that you can check out up here. But here we get to something that for me personally is really interesting, and that is, where are all of these airlines going to find pilots for their brand spanking new aircraft that are on order? Back in 2021 and even now in 2022, most of the airlines have been able to pick up some of the pilots that they made redundant during the pandemic, but that pool is shrinking very, very fast. We are already seeing some of the effects that this is having on the industry, where there was a lot of flights cancelled in the beginning of the summer because of a lack of cabin crew and pilots. And also a few of the cabin crew and pilot unions are starting to vote for strike action in order to get the terms and conditions back that they had prior to the pandemic, or in the case of SAS, which striked just a month ago, to get their colleagues rehired on the same terms and conditions as they were promised. We're also hearing some really interesting reports from the regional airlines in the US, which are really clamoring to find pilots at the moment. First, Piedmont Airlines and Envoy Air nearly doubled their salary to their pilots in June, and then another airline called Commute Air also greatly improved their terms and conditions as well as their salary for their pilots. And the most recent thing I heard is that when ExpressJet, another regional airline, went bankrupt recently, both Piedmont and Envoy offered to take on their pilots without even requiring an interview, which is almost unheard of. These are remarkable stories, and it points to one thing, and that is that it's hard for these airlines to find pilots with the amount of money that they're offering. So they have to increase both salaries and terms and conditions, which is great news for pilots out there. Now, the other airlines out there seem to have picked up where this is heading as well, with companies like United, for example, starting up their own flight academy called Aviate, and other airlines building partnerships with flight schools in order to try to secure the supply of pilots coming in. There's even been discussions in the US Senate about increasing the retirement age from 65 to 67 among pilots in order to try to stem this pilot shortage that's coming, but that hasn't really gained much traction. All of this is really good news for experienced pilots out there who are hopefully going to find it easier to find employment going forward. But it's also really good news for those of you out there who are thinking about maybe taking up this profession, maybe becoming professional pilots. If you are thinking about that, then consider coming over towards the Pilot Expo in Berlin, which is going to take place on the 24th to the 25th of February next year. I'm going to be there and talking about what's happening in the business, and I hope to see you there. Also, it's really important that before you start any type of training, you make sure that you have what it takes to become a pilot. And the best way of doing so is to join up with the Airline Pilot Club. I'm going to give you a link to the Airline Pilot Club down here. It's completely free and they have a lot of great resources for anyone who's thinking about joining the business. Anyway, the travel chaos that we've seen during the summer and that actually looks like it's letting up a little bit now was largely caused by some of those predictions that we talked about earlier on in the video, where some of the organizations just thought that this recovery would come much later than it actually did. And for those who made the prediction that the recovery would come this early, some of those airlines and airports have found that it's not as easy to find people to do these jobs anymore, at least not for the salaries that they are offering. So they are going to have to increase the salaries, and if they have to pay more to the pilots, to the cabin crew, and also for all of the workers that are working around the airports, well, then it is very possible that what we will see for the next couple of months and possibly years is increases in ticket prices. It's going to be more expensive to fly, and that's my prediction right now. What do you think? Put your comment into the comment section below. Make sure that you have subscribed to the channel, and if you want to support the work that I do, then consider becoming part of my lovely Patreon crew or get yourself some merch. Now check out this video next. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.